How's it going, guys? I'm Robert from Untitled Visuals, and today I want to take a look at this variable ND from Revar Cine. Now, I'll be upfront, I've never really liked using variable NDs. They're a pain to manage, they usually have awful color, and there usually aren't a lot of options when using larger cinema glass. That all being said, you can't really beat the convenience of variable NDs. Being able to both quickly and literally dial in exposure makes it super easy to maintain a desired f-stop when you're deep in the trenches. Many of you know I'm a big fan of the FX6 and FX9, and this is one of the many reasons why. You get up to 7 stops of reduction with virtually zero color shift across the entire range. There are a handful of variable ND matte boxes floating around, and a lot of people like gassing up Polar Pro, but their variable ND matte box is proprietary as shit because you're only able to use filters designed by Polar Pro due to the thinner stages.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
Now, there are hundreds of videos online talking about variable NDs, but none of them actually explain how they work, so here's a quick primer. Variable ND is essentially two polarizers working together, one linear and one circular. Now, the purpose of a polarizer is to block polarized light from passing through the filter, which can come from a variety of sources. Polarized light is when waves of light travel uniformly across a single plane. But where does polarized light come from? Light can be polarized by a few different methods, but you'll mainly see it from reflections from non-metallic surfaces. As it bounces off the surface, the waves begin traveling uniformly. Think of a polarizing filter as a gate. When the gate is aligned with waves of a similar plane, the light will pass, but when the gate is adjusted perpendicular, the waves will be blocked and won't be allowed through. This is exactly what happens when you use a polarizer with your lens. Since reflected light is polarized, you're blocking those uniform waves from entering the lens. The biggest variable comes down to angle and surface. And as a general rule of thumb, you'll achieve the maximum effect when the light is perpendicular from the source, and when adjusted, it can help cut through reflective surfaces like glass or water and can completely change the look of your image. Another benefit of this is the added richness in color. For example, when I use a polarizer in this shot, you can see a massive reduction in reflected blue light, which really draws out the richness in greens and yellows. So what does this have to do with variable NDs? Well, this is actually how variable NDs work. As I mentioned earlier, a variable ND are two polarizers stacked together. You can see this demonstrated when we hold up a linear polarizer, and since the light traveling through that linear polarizer is polarized, by adjusting the circular polarizer on the lens, we're adjusting the so-called gate to let less light through. A circular polarizer is actually the same as a linear polarizer. The reason it's called a circular polarizer is because of the added quarter wave plate on the back. Now, I won't get too technical on this, but essentially spins the outgoing light into a spiral, effectively unpolarizing the light. This is why circular polarizers have a label designating the direction and should always be placed behind your linear polarizer. A lot of older camera systems and metering require unpolarized light to work properly, which is why circular polarizers exist. If you're still having trouble wrapping your head around this concept, I've left a few additional resources in the description below. Now back to Revar Cine's variable ND, the polarizing foil is matched per filter to reduce color shift and has an anti-reflective coating that handles reflections like a champ. One of my biggest grievances with traditional variable NDs that are screwed onto the lens is the horrendous flaring, especially when shooting outside. I always prefer using matte boxes if I can, not because they make my camera look cooler, but because of its primary purpose, reducing flares. Now, Revar Cine's variable NDs aren't protected against IR pollution, but most modern sensors are able to handle the light reduction without issue. If you're using a camera that's IR sensitive, you might want to consider picking up an IR cut filter, but even when paired with something like a Pocket 6K, it handles pretty well. I wanted to see how the Revar NDs stacked up against traditional and internal NDs, so as a baseline, I shot the scene at T22 on the FX6 and gradually increased exposure while introducing different NDs. With the internal electronic variable ND, there's virtually zero color shift. When using the Revar Cine variable ND, there is a slight shift, but that's mainly due to the polarizer kicking in. The important thing to note here is that I wouldn't know the difference unless I saw them side by side like this. In practical use, there's no perceivable color shift, and I'd have no issue throwing these in front of my lenses. So who is this for? Well, it obviously depends on what camera you're using. It doesn't really make a ton of sense for something like an FX6 or FX9, but they would be invaluable on cameras without internal NDs like a Red or the older Blackmagic Pocket cameras. Since these are designed for traditional 4x5 matte boxes, Revar Cine offers multiple kits depending on what you already have. Kit A is the most universal and is what I'd personally recommend. It takes up to 2 standard matte box trays and includes a 4x5 linear polarizer and a 138mm circular polarizer in a rota tray. Kit B is meant for matte boxes that already have a 138mm rear tray and pairs well with something like the Misfit Atom Pola. Kit C is actually the same as Kit B, except that it includes a bright Tangerine 1 tray if you have a Misfit kick. It holds a regular 4x5 filter and a 138mm round filter, all within a single tray. If you appreciate my content here on YouTube, I've recently started a Patreon to help support the channel and continue the conversation. If you're willing to support, there are a handful of exclusive perks available, including a industry Discord where you can better get in touch with me or the community. Hopefully this video is helpful in some way. If you're interested in picking up your own set, there is an affiliate link down in the description. Having a variable ND is pretty high on my list of priorities when I'm doing run-and-gun dock work. If I'm traveling with something like a Red, a kit like this is much easier to travel with rather than bringing an entire set of NDs, which I've done plenty of times before, just to avoid using variable NDs. As much as I love my set of rhodiums, they serve a different purpose for different jobs, and the only thing to keep in mind here is the added polarization you might get whenever you're using variable NDs. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.